Hello and welcome to this webinar on the Financial Advice Market Review and the role of technology in the advice process. We are asking, did RDR fail and can tech save the day? My name is Jenna Towler. I'm Editor of Retirement Planner and Deputy Editor of Professional Advisor. Joining me today are panellists Mark Loosemore, Executive General Manager Wealth for IRESS, Chris Pitt, Head of Market Analysis at IRESS, and Chris Dames, Director at Cervelo Financial Planning.
Morning, Jenna.
The topic of conversation today is the Financial Advice Market Review, an investigation into the availability of advice from the Treasury and Financial Conduct Authority. Looking at the first slide, the review aims to close the advice gap created as a result of the Retail Distribution Review, which saw many people priced out of financial advice. It also aims to give regulatory clarity so firms can innovate and grow. The review also wants to assess opportunities and challenges presented by new technology. Looking at the second slide, the scope of the advice review is quite broad. The FCA and Treasury will assess the needs, what needs to change in the current regulatory framework, and investigate if consumers get the right information to empower financial decision making. The review comes after Pensions Freedom and Choice was introduced in April, which will result in thousands of retirees, many with modest-sized pension pots, seeking help at the point of retirement. Today, we ask if the review itself has divulged an uncomfortable truth about the RDR. The RDR set out to transform the world of retail investment advice, banning commission and mandating higher minimum qualifications for all advisors. Its goals were far-reaching and included providing clarity to consumers and removing the potential for bias from advisors' recommendations. But a lesser-known objective was for more consumers to have their needs addressed. It is on this last point we ask, did RDR fail? Please do send in your questions to the panellists throughout the debate. You can also tweet about it using the hashtag RDRTech. If you would like CPD accreditation for taking part in this event, please ask a question saying you want CPT accreditation, including your email address. Someone from the team will get in touch. Mark, let me ask you, did the RDR fail and can farmers succeed? While the FCA has declared RDR is working, what is the sense among advisors and other stakeholders of its impact?
Well, it's a big question, and I'll start on the positive side. I think what RDR did achieve is it helped raise the professional standards within the industry, and I think also it removed that commission bias that so many people were worried about. Where it probably didn't go quite far enough is probably on the clarity of communication that it was trying to address. Did people really understand the terms, and I mean end consumers rather than people within the industry, understand the terms around restricted versus independent? Are the charges clear enough for people still? Can they calculate themselves and work them out so that they can go and shop around? I'm not sure it really addressed that. And then if we look at, of course, the advice gap, which is talked around a lot at the moment, and there's nothing new about the advice gap. It's it's as old as Bobby Moore's football boots, but it really is something that hasn't been fully addressed by our RDR, and that's where we're now trying to see the new review look and gain some traction.
Mm-hmm. Chris?
Yes, I certainly think the RDR had some very big pluses. It has moved what was an industry into a profession, which I think is a good move. It has largely eradicated the product bias driven by commission, etc. But I always think that actually improving access, whilst it wasn't sort of top of the agenda, it was still a big objective. And I think in that particular area, you've got to say that likely it hasn't worked. You've seen the banks actually step out of the market, and I think that's where the biggest gap has emerged, because perhaps it was the banks who were serving more of the mass market. Numbers of advisors has actually stayed pretty much the same, and they're still servicing primarily the wealthier clients, and the banks have stepped out. And I think the government is quite rightly now saying this is a problem that society has to resolve. We have more people saving more through auto-enrolment, they're having bigger pension pots as a result, and they need some help or guidance or advice. And I think, Mark, you're quite right to raise the point there, well, what exactly is it? I think what we do know is that more mass market consumers do need something in the terms of help.
So I think the interesting thing for me is, and in my opinion, RDR didn't fail, because what it did is start the process of turning our industry into a profession, which was fundamentally important in terms of getting the foundations right. Now, what's happened off the basis of that is a number of unintended consequences. The banks coming out of the market is one of them, which has left a gap that's always been there but continues to grow. So RDR didn't fail, but pharma is the evolution of regulation. And actually, if you look back, that's nothing new. You know, we've always had continuing regulation, both to accommodate the changing market and to accommodate the market challenges that continue to rise. So I think that's just going to carry on.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. What, if anything, does pharma tell us about the success of RDR? Chris?
Well, I think, you know, as we were just saying there, you know, it tells us that it was an unfinished task. I think, as you're quite rightly saying there, Chris, you know, did some good things, but now we have to move on. And I think, you know, pharma is really just saying that, you know, the high net worth market has been improved, but that mass market really is an issue that needs to be addressed. So I think, you know, as you quite rightly say, it's the next step, the next big problem that we really do need to address.
There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, it's quite a natural thing to do a major piece of legislation such as our RDR, and then follow that up with something that says, how did it work, and let's move on to the next stage of things. Particularly as things have changed. We've had pensions freedom since then, which has put more demand on advice. So it's wholly appropriate that it does take that point now and then try and take it to the next stage. It's an evolution of advice.
Mm-hmm. Chris?
So what was the question, Jeff?
It was, what, if anything, does pharma tell us about the success of RDR?
Great question. Absolutely nothing.
Okay.
So I'd love to give you some really great insight into what RDR tells us, but actually the legislation's separate, and even though part of RDR was to deliver solutions that work for the mass market, I think it was, as I said, it was just a foundation that pharma's now going to build on. Let's judge RDR on its success in terms of turning an industry into a profession, and let's judge the success of pharma on how it delivers solutions that are right for the mass market. Now, none of this is entirely independent. You know, financial regulation is full of unintended consequences, auto enrolment being one and pensions freedoms being another. But I think the most sensible approach to any form of regulation is just to focus on the most immediate problem, try and solve that by regulation, know that there will be unintended consequences, and then try to solve those.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's great. At this point, I'm going to launch our first poll of the morning. We're asking, how important do you see the role of technology in being able to offer affordable advice? Okay, so I'm just going to launch that now. And, okay, I'm going to announce the results of that in about 15 minutes, so do vote. Moving on, what does affordable mean in the context of regulated advice? So research varies on the amount of money people will be prepared to pay for regulated advice. Is it even possible to arrive at an average figure? Thoughts, Chris?
Right, okay, it's a big question, really, because how much would you pay depends exactly what the service is and how much you need it and how much money you've got, etc. So it's a huge question, and I don't think there is a specific answer. I suppose what we can say, though, is that if you're looking again at that mass market, which is sort of a bit of a focus for this session, is that, you know, the traditional advice model comes at a fairly high price point. It's a good service, absolutely, and is applicable to a certain group of clients. But for mass market consumers, you know, and most people in this country don't save, and those that do don't save a lot. Actually looking at that, then the price tag for advice is sort of out of kilter in terms of what it is that they actually want. So I think, you know, if you look at the consumer research that has been done around the mass market, if people are prepared to pay at all, it's probably in the low hundreds, the sort of £100, £200, £300 at most, that sort of level for a mass market. But it just depends on your circumstances and what you're buying, really.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think there's two circumstances that we need to take into account. Number one, what consumers are prepared to pay, but also what level of advice and service businesses can deliver to make it a healthy market. Mm-hmm. So both those factors need to be encountered to ensure that the market works as it should. But in terms of the scope and range of what people are prepared to pay, our private clients, our consultative clients, the clients who want a bespoke service, are happy to pay thousands of pounds. But it will range all the way down to somebody who will want it for the cost of a chunky Kit Kat. You know, it's just really, or your chocolate of choice. I mean, I don't know what you prefer, Jenna. I mean, I like chunky Kit Kats, to be honest. So I think the fact you've got that wide range of diversity means two things. Currently, we can deliver advice at the higher end because it's bespoke, personal, and means that we can spend more time with their clients. If people are looking for solutions that are at the lower end of the market, we need to think about how to structure our business models in order to deliver that.
Yeah, I think it's spot on. It comes down to the business proposition that you're offering to the client, the value proposition that you're offering. And I think it's very easy for a report to be written where you've gone out and asked the consumer how much will you pay for it, and they'll say X price. If you can actually articulate the value that you're giving them, that you're going to help them reach a certain goal, you're going to improve investment performance, you're going to make tax savings, and it becomes a very different question. And I think the other thing that I think is quite interesting is how the price sensitivity changes as you move through the value chain of the services that you're offering. I remember a very interesting conversation I had with a lady at the IFP where she was telling me that, you know, when she was in a transactional mode, selling a piece of life assurance, that was a really price-sensitive piece of business to be working on. As she moved to looking at maybe needs-specific, I'm saving for this goal, this retirement, it became a little less price-sensitive. But when she moved into full lifetime cash flow planning type scenarios, it became much more about value and much more significant.
I think a key factor on that is because at that end, that level of service, you're helping people answer the intangible questions of life as opposed to just being around a product. And actually, the technology we've got at the moment can't get anywhere close to what a human can do in terms of that.
Yes, and I think you could raise a good point there in terms of the sorts of advice. You know, if I just want advice on a specific, which product should I buy, A or B, or which portfolio should I go in, and I just want a one-off discrete piece of advice, that's very different to, actually, I want to enter into an ongoing, relationship, and you manage my portfolio and everything else associated with it. So, how much we charge for advice? Well, we've really got to define what it is that we're offering.
What's the service?
What's the service?
And even with a single client, you may be offering multiple services. So you, at times, will be wanting to give that holistic approach, but when it comes to ISA season, they may want a different service altogether. So I think mixing and matching the proposition, but having that clear so the consumer understands the value is absolutely.
One of the interesting things we've found is we've had employer clients use our A-in-the-box service to deal with their auto-enrolment needs, but wouldn't dream of using a robo-advisor for their personal needs. So in terms of mix and matching for different niches and different solutions, I think you're right.
And we all do it, as consumers. We tend to think of our finances more broadly than just sort of our life and pensions. Most consumers think of everything, their motor insurance, their bank account. And do we mix and match? Of course we do. We're all happy to go online and we'll buy our motor insurance, our household insurance, but we might ask our friends about pensions, we might take to an advisor. So we're used to mixing and matching all the time.
I think the interesting pieces of technology in that space is the hubs, and I think Aviva are doing some work around it at the minute that hold everything you've got with Aviva under one app. That's quite interesting because it creates that brand loyalty that people like.
And that's certainly something. I mean, we've done some research at IRESS, and what do customers value? Yes, I'd love to be able to see all my finances, and I mean all my finances in one single place.
And there's technology that does that now.
Absolutely.
And when we start getting pensions dashboards in the future and stuff like that, this is going to really open up where people are going to go online to see their retirement positions on those dashboards, and then we need to be offering advice services that wrap around that.
But the interesting thing is that also drives efficiencies for the advisor.
Absolutely.
Within my business, my team spend the majority of our private client management is on platform, but there's always the exception where there's somebody with 5 or 6 policies held elsewhere that it's quite a labour-intensive job within my business. So the solutions which make that easier affect the way that we consider pricing?
Yeah, I think, you know, as we move further forward, we're going to see technology doing more and more of what I call the grunt, and leaving the advisor to do the value-added stuff, the soft stuff. And, you know, I think that's a world that we're going to have to embrace.
I completely agree, and I think quite often when we get into the discussions about mass market, we do go straight down and start talking about D2C sites, robo-advice, but this is a real place where, you know, back-office systems now can provide some real benefits that can drive down the cost of face-to-face advice and traditional advice processes, and therefore make that more affordable too.
So we've had a question from Colin Wallace. He believes the key question for him is who is going to close the circle between what mass market consumers are prepared to pay for advice and what makes it commercially viable for advisors. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
Well, that's certainly an interesting question, and I think, you know, there are new players and existing players coming into that particular market. I'd say, you know, LV has had a presentation of theirs the other day. They've just now launched an online service, so you can actually go online and self-serve for regulated advice, and they were saying this in front of the regulator, so I kind of think it was all right. And they're charging, got an interesting charging model. Flat fee, £199 for the advice. That's it. Doesn't matter what you're asking for, whether it's a simple question or complex sort of IHT. If it's IHT, they'll probably siphon it off and do it in the background. But there you are. Yes, so I think there are models now, people stepping into that market, and LV aren't the only ones by any stretch of the imagination. So I think, yes, people are starting to try and close the circle. There'll be many who try, some will fail.
I think the challenge to go alongside that, though, is there are now solutions like LV and other electronic systems, Money on Toast said so, etc., that can start to address those needs. But we need to also pull the demand forward as well from the mass market, because we're not talking about a mass market here that has leftover money that they're looking to, how do I spend this in investments? You've actually got to persuade them through education and needs disturbance that they actually need to go and use these sites as well. So we've got a whole education and awareness piece to drive the mass market to those needs.
Of course, with the pensions, freedoms and changes that, you know, that they're almost being pushed into. You've got these freedoms.
At the retirement space.
The retirement space.
So going further forward in lifetime.
So who's going to close the circle? Not one business. You know, it's going to be a bunch of different businesses who develop solutions. But if you look at any other sector, there's normally sort of 3 or 4 key players that really drive, especially in the technology space. You know, when I think of accommodation, I think of Airbnb. You know, Airbnb are the most prominent one out there at the minute, but also hotels.com and things like that. So you'll have prominent providers who close the circle. The reality is we don't know yet. Because we haven't seen that evolution in terms of enough people developing solutions that have been commercially successful yet. But it's interesting in terms of bringing that demand forward, because I firmly believe that demand comes from workplace. If you've got a situation where, as we've discussed already, RDR meant the bank stepped away from the market, where do people get advice now? Where do people trust? And actually, their workplaces where they can talk to their friends, and especially with auto enrolment where everybody's got a pension scheme, is going to be one of the most pertinent places they can go.
I think that's entirely right. I think the workplace is a key area, but I mean also I think, you know, the banks will come back into the market. We know that they stepped out, but they can't afford to step out forever. They have to be back in there because their customers want those services. And I think we have to recognise that they control 80–90% of our current accounts, and we come back to that point about aggregating and seeing all your finances in one place. They are in a kind of good place to actually do that.
I think there's two factors that mean that the banks have got a huge advantage over most businesses. Number one, brand, because even though their brand has been potentially damaged over the last few years, it's still powerful. Number two, customers. You know, they've got clients. They've got a huge base. However, what you find with many larger organisations is that they're not particularly fast movers. So it'll be interesting to see whether they buy a solution from a small technology provider or build something themselves, and we don't know yet.
Yeah, I think the other people in the community we can't rule out is the product providers themselves, because they have a real need. They have orphan clients, and that's driving them to invest in this area. So, and that can be through a direct sales force. I mean, Prudential with PFP have a growing, successful sales force that are offering low-cost solutions through to people launching D2C solutions. And without wishing to say everybody could square the circle, the other thing I wouldn't rule out is actually some of the small companies are doing this, nimble, creative, coming up with new innovations. And actually, if you look at Money on Toast, said so, they're not the large advisory firms, they're actually quite nimble people that have seen an opportunity and are reacting quickly to it.
Just to throw one other category, because it is an environment where there's lots of plays. We've got some very large players coming across from the States. I mean, Vanguard, etc., are coming in, and they have some very deep pockets to throw at this. So, but deep pockets aren't always necessarily the answer.
And you're seeing it's a good point, because you're seeing people now going out and buying people to play in this space that are from. So Parmenion were bought by Aberdeen. And a large part of that, I'm sure, was to do with their simplified advice offering that they've got. So you have got a whole host of people lining up to play in this space. Yeah. Who's going to win and close the circle is going to be really interesting. Yeah,
I think it will be exciting. But the other interesting thing is how niches are going to develop in this market. So through A in the Box, we've decided to focus on the corporate niche, and that works really well for us. But actually, you might find solutions that are focused on specifically mums aged 30 to 50, because their potential needs are different to somebody who's a baby boomer who's approaching retirement. So I think there's a bunch of solutions that could work.
We've had another question come through from a viewer. Graham Setterfield asks, do you see potential channel disruption with technology and information companies like Google becoming challengers to the status quo? Mark?
Again, I've heard the disruption from those brands mooted for many, many years, and it happens at a level, but it seems to be more at the transactional level. When Marks and Spencer's in financial services, it really wouldn't get to the advice part of the value chain. However, those brands are huge and have huge amount of money to throw at it. So if it's ever going to happen, now could be that time. But I wouldn't underestimate the need for expertise to get it right, that understands financial services, understands the regulatory environment, and it's that regulatory environment that's probably the biggest barrier to entry to those guys, and the risk appetite for those players to play in the regulatory environment would make me still a little bit sceptical, but I think there will be some disruption around, but I'm not quite sure it'll be as huge as we think.
Yeah, I agree, Mark. I mean, I think in terms of there will be disruption. I mean, if you look over at the States and the robo-advisors over there, it is clearly an out-and-out disruptor play. If you listen to the people who started the first robo-advisors, it's quite clearly that was their intention, to disrupt the market. So I think disruptive models is coming about. Do I think Google will do it? I think if they were, they'd have probably made moves in that direction. I think they probably just have too many other interesting, exciting opportunities. And this one feels actually, as Mark says, you need a lot of specialist knowledge actually to do it properly, and I suspect that they're looking in other areas at the moment. Well, I hope they are.
Yeah, disruption is an interesting question, because I think, first of all, number one, people assume that technology is going to just completely change their existing advice business. If you advice as a city, there's naysayers out there who say this is the destruction of an advice metropolis with this technology coming into play. In reality, there's enough scope for all different models to be available. Now, when it comes to sort of Google and some of the big tech firms, they've definitely got the brand. They've got the client list. They've got a huge amount of people they can get access to. I just don't see the appetite being there at the minute.
No. I also think that where the technology play becomes most powerful, when it's joined up with other advice services. Yep. So I actually see a world where we've almost got a unified advice service across telephone, technology, face-to-face. And when those are all working together, that's when it's most powerful. Now, Google are never going to do that, I don't think. They would have to go in and acquire an advice firm to get that level of expertise. So I think there are barriers to entry that should stop some of those.
I think the other interesting point to raise in terms of that is, financial advice and financial planning is still fundamentally based on trust. Okay, so when people use our online corporate solution, they're in a position where they come through the 300 plus advisors and accountants who are comfortable using us. So that's a trust relationship, right? So you've got our clients going to their accountants who are trusting A in a box to do it. If Google come in, and the brand might generate some trust, but they're still going to want to speak to somebody.
Would you give that key data to Google?
You probably do already.
You probably do, without realising it, probably.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, guys. At this point, I'm going to announce the results of the first poll. We asked, how important do you see the role of technology in being able to offer affordable advice? Final results are extremely important, just over 50%. Important for just over nearly 43%, so basically very important. And you should be seeing those results now. Okay, so I'm going to launch the second poll. We're asking this time, what is your biggest concern for your business growth? Increased regulatory fees, growing administrative burden, changing consumer demand, or growing competition? Okay, and you can also tweet. We are on hashtag RDR Tech. And moving on to technology, which is what we're here to talk about today. To what extent is technology responsible for more affordable advice options coming through? Chris?
Yeah, well, I think, technology is an enabler, and I think, as we described earlier on, there is that latent demand, and that it's becoming more apparent as people are more auto-enrolled. They have that need for advice, and technology is probably the only way that we are going to deliver advice, guidance, help, support, whatever we like to call it, to that mass market at a more attractive price, a price which they can actually reach. So, and I think, as you were saying, Chris, there, we shouldn't be looking at technology as an alternative. It's either technology enabled or it's not. It's going to be different blends and mixes, and I think we need to start looking at how do we use technology to design and deliver services which different communities can actually afford and reach. So yes, can we define a service which is available as LV have done at £199, etc., or less? How do we design and deliver that? But then we can also use technology to deliver far more enhanced, richer services for people who can afford that as well.
Mark?
No, I agree, and I go back to the point that the technology is also behind the scenes. So even if you've got a more traditional advice model, the technology doing the valuations for you behind the scenes, maybe building in workflows to stream and give you consistent service. I think all of that's a really important part of driving the cost of advice down. And I say cost of advice, we also need to talk about service as well, because with that advice comes service levels, and actually using technology to flag up those points where people need service, a portfolio's gone out of balance, whatever, is also absolutely key from technology, and that can help people become more proactive. And I think doing that proactivity at a cost point that's realistic as well.
Yeah, so I think technology absolutely plays a fundamental part in two ways. Number one, it helps existing practices improve the efficiencies within their business and access new niches, so it can be used to access specialisms. So one of the things about accessing affordable price is, how do you drive the cost down? Okay, well, you systemise and automate as much as you can in terms of the business process, and if you can use technology to do that, great. But the other interesting factor is, how do you then use technology as a marketing tool to attract new clients, especially around the workplace, and there's technology solutions available to do that. And education solutions designed to do that. So I think technology will fundamentally change the way we look at advice. Whether will it ever replace existing advice models? I'm not convinced it will, because you still want that relationship of trust with your advisor.
But I think something we were touching on earlier was, how do you actually engage consumers? And I think, the technology, again, has a real huge role to play there. I mean, in terms of social media, we all use Facebook, LinkedIn, etc. And I think that's how, and it's not an age thing, we all expect certain things to be available online and through social media, etc. And we expect to be able to interact and execute quickly. So maybe part of what we need to be doing is not just looking at the current business model, which is right for some people, but there are perhaps other business models which are appropriate, which can be delivered through technology and more instant, because we're in that sort of environment.
I think what we're seeing at the moment in the private client space is a real growth in direct-to-consumer platforms with some attitude to risk technology at the front. But that's just the first evolution of this stuff. I think what we'll see more of. I've got a game on my phone. And I'm addicted to it. It's called Battle Cats. It's available on Android. I'm not selling it, but it's just really addictive. And it gamifies my experience, so I keep on coming back for more. And there's no financial incentive involved in that. I do it for fun.
Yes.
And is that missing from the experience we deliver to consumers?
I mean, again, once on that gamification, I've seen a marvellous app which is, educating people around pensions and how you have to contribute, etc. And they've done it in terms of using algorithm in terms of jumbo jets.
Okay.
So the more you invest, the higher your plane goes, and then when you're coming down to retirement, you have to land the plane softly.
Okay.
And again, it's great fun and it's addictive, but you're learning as you go, and you're seeing what the impact is of putting money in and taking money out, and it's very good.
I think there's some really good ones in the States. So there's things like iBloom, which uses the flowers blooming and growing with your portfolio. There's things like iBillionaire, which tracks portfolios of billionaire investors. So you can model your portfolios against them, and you sort of then can take it down the pub and discuss the things.
My flower's bigger than your flower, is that what we say?
The other one which I quite liked, which was like to get the competitive thing in. I've seen one around, I think it was called Flex Score, where your score, they give you a score for your financial awareness and your financial prowess, and then gives you things to do to improve it. And those things would be do an online ATR or whatever that drives you down a certain route. But it scores you and shows you how you are against peers of your age group, of your income salary, that sort of thing.
There's a great book by a guy called Ryan Holiday who talks a lot about the gamification. It's called Growth Hacker Marketing. Worth picking up because it just talks about that experience. And when we look at Facebook, surely all Facebook is when we put photos up is just a social game. It's an element of primarily we put photos up to show our family, because our family are all over the country. But it's always quite nice when somebody says, "Oh, Sophie's looking lovely," or "Charlotte's looking lovely." So there's an element of social gaming involved in Facebook too.
Okay, thank you for that. A bit of a broad question here. Are consumers sceptical about technology, and might this dissipate as the generations become more used to being online? Chris?
Yeah, I think I would almost turn that around the other way, and I think consumers, if you consider how far technology has come in the last sort of 20-odd years and what we expect technology to do, I think in terms of our industry, we're probably lagging a little bit behind, and our consumers expect us to be doing more with technology. So I don't think they're reticent about using it. If anything, they want to see us do more. They expect us to do more and use more technology more quickly.
Yeah, the only thing I would challenge the question on is I don't think it's a generational thing. So the surveys that I've seen have shown that someone that is 25 is broadly accessing social media and transacting online a similar amount to someone that's 65. This goes right across the age gap. What's probably worth pointing out, though, is that doesn't happen with income. So someone that's on less than 20,000 will be online less than someone that's earning over 60,000. So if we bring this back to the topic of the review and how that's attacking the mass market, we do have to work out how technology can be used, bearing in mind that maybe that mass market isn't as as naturally suited to the technology as some of the upper end of the market.
Yeah.
Chris?
I think what's interesting to me is that I don't see there's a generation gap in technology at all. I mean, my mum on Facebook, you can't get her off it now. She's on it all the time, and actually the generation of silver surfers are empowered by technology far more than anybody ever realised years ago. So I use the example of my mum, and obviously this might not be backed up by data analysis. Just using my mum as an example, but she's my barometer. So my mum loves social media. She likes Facebook. She loves banking online. She's banked online for a number of years, and she uses services that have two things in common. Number one, they're really easy to use. And I think that's what's missing in terms of the financial services online propositions we develop. Currently, they're in the process of becoming easier to use, but still relatively clunky when you compare it to some of the sort of more mature technology. But also number two, there's always an incentive to go back. So that's when it comes to gamification of those models, and you see that work time and time again.
Mm-hmm. We've had another question from Fraser Donaldson, who's asking, who should pay for technology, the advisor or client? Should it be directly or indirectly? There's actually three questions. Who does it benefit most?
I think the setup of the technology is going to have to be done by the firm that's running the financial process. I mean, the charging model will have to recover that, so indirectly the client will pay for it initially. But particularly when we're in this evolutionary stage, I don't think any one client will invest enough to do that. So I think we're going to be looking to the larger firms to lead that way.
I mean, I think, yes, I'd agree, it is the firms that are going to have to invest, and I think we should be cognizant of the fact that, there's a fintech operations, etc., industry down in the city, and it's literally billions that are being invested in new technology, be it artificial intelligence, etc., because the prizes are actually huge. But you don't have to be huge to invest in technology and use it. I mean, just quite the example of Money on Toast. Fairly small firm there, a subsidiary of just an advisor firm based down in Winchester. Saw an opportunity, got out and hired some developers, not many, just created it themselves, and they're up and running. So it's not always the big pockets, but I think it has to be the advisor community, the provider community, etc., that's going to make that investment. Mm-hmm.
So for me, I think the key factor is, does it make sense as a business model? And some business models, it makes sense where the end user pays. So for A in the Box, that's the employer, and we've opted for that approach. Mm-hmm. For some business models, especially the back office ones, it makes sense that the advisor pays for that and then passes the cost on, because actually the employer doesn't see the value of those back office solutions directly. I think that's the key factor. But there's a bunch of different business models that work, but it needs to be sustainable for your business. Mm-hmm. I think the interesting point about where that technology comes from, through A in a Box, we're probably, as an advisory firm, an exception in terms of investing quite a significant amount in technology. But the reason we've done it is because the rewards are so big, if you get it right.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm just going to announce the results of the second poll. We asked, what is your biggest concern for your business growth? And quite evenly split between increased regulatory fees with 37% and growing administrative burden with almost 36%. And yes, I should see that on your screens now. Okay, and moving on to consumer responsibility. Is it time we recognise consumer responsibility in financial decisions? Would safe harbour for advisors help smooth the transition to robo-advice? Chris?
I think the safe harbour idea is a very interesting one, and if it could come about, I think it could deliver huge benefits. And I think it's quite interesting that it was the minister that actually stood up at the FCA's recent conference and floated that idea. Yep. So I think that's really interesting that the government are in the background sort of driving that pace and recognising that there are issues like, would a safe harbour help, and can we make that come about? Are there other things that we could do in terms of the sandbox idea? I.e., can we create an environment where you can try new ideas out with live customers, but don't have to have quite all of the investment and regulatory control around it? So I think there are interesting things, and I think a safe harbour would be great. Can it actually happen? Lots of challenges to come about. I'd like to think that there were, through the industry, we could agree some general guidance, rules, principles that it's a good idea to pay off your expensive credit card debt before you start investing. Those sorts of things which could generally help move, the consumers forward a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love the idea of a safe harbour from a technology company's point of view. It would be great. It would encourage investment. And I think we have seen some successes around the globe. So in America and Australia, those concepts have gained some traction. I'm a little bit sceptical that politically, despite it having government support at the moment, that it will go all the way. I think the people that we're aiming this at are the mass market, and if we're trying to make the mass market adopt this, they're probably the people that can least afford to take the liability and the risk of those financial transactions. So I feel a little bit nervous that we will get the political will to drive that through when it comes to it. Maybe in time, but not quite yet. I think the other thing is just making sure that any rules that we're coming up with there are then in line with sort of FOS initiatives as well, because they focus on outcome based of the advice process.
And I think that was very interesting in the pharma scope. They are going to look at the role of FOS.
Yeah, it's more joined up.
So far more joined up.
I completely agree with both of you, Chris and Mark, because one of the factors we need to focus on to drive innovation is that clear line in the sand. That would have a massive impact. The challenge you face is if the liability is shifting away from the solution, where does it sit? And is it fair to put it on the consumer? Yeah. If it's not, does it then sit with the FCA and as a risk-adverse organisation? Yeah, maybe not. But let's see. If they really, if pharma, which has the potential to be quite revolutionary, takes that step, that'd be great.
And there have been bold decisions made recently.
Well, that's right. I mean, you could argue with the introduction of auto-enrolment. I mean, is that not the government giving advice to employees? We advise you to go into a pension.
I completely see that, and I mean, let's not underestimate the impact of the behavioural finance unit in terms of the government's decisions, and you'll see more nudge-style decisions moving forward. But the key factor is what you need is a clear line in the sand, a clear line in terms of the responsibility if things do go wrong, and I'd like to see that not being on the consumer, and a clear communication between FSA and FSA. I'm back in '95. FCA and FOS in terms of liability.
I just think it's interesting that it's the Treasury and the government have stepped in.
There might be enough political will to do it. You never know. You never know. We'll see.
We'll see.
And finally, I think we're coming towards the end of our time today, but finally we're just going to ask, is it time we stopped calling it robo-advice? Chris?
Right, OK, I'll start on the soapbox. And I'm unashamedly repeat something I heard at a conference the other day, so thanks to the person who said it. But there are probably only two prefixes worse than robo that you'd put in front of a device, and they are bad and corrupt. I think really as a term, it really doesn't do any favours to the huge beneficial role that technology can bring to the party in terms of advice. It conjures up this sort of image of some machine in the background is going to replace all of those educated advisors out there, and I think that's entirely the wrong way to look at it. So I'd like to see us drop that internally with the industry. I know we never use it with consumers, etc., but it just gives the wrong impression. Technology has a huge beneficial role to play. We should start looking at it positively and get rid of that horrible label.
Yeah, agree. So when I'm a kid of the 80s and early 90s. So when I think of robots, I think of the Terminator and not RoboCop, but Ed 209, the big machine that used to stalk round. So robos, in terms of connotations, is not overwhelmingly positive for me. So yes, I'd scrap robo advice today. I'd get rid of it now. What we call it is yet to be decided, because if you look at the disruption in the cab industry, you don't call that robocabs, you call that Uber, and you don't call Amazon robo shopping. So what we need is a name that everybody can agree on, but I think the biggest player in a few years' time will just call it, I don't know, Said So, or Nutmeg, or whoever that big player is. But for now, I think e-advice is quite nice. That's what I'm using.
Mark, any thoughts?
Well, I was brought up in the late 70s, early 80s, so my robos are R2D2 and CP3O.
Now they're good robots. They're good robot role models. They're good robot role models. What happened in the 80s then? Why did we assume robots are bad? Westworld though. Westworld was bad. But actually, I'm less hung up on it, because I think the end consumer won't talk about it in robo terms. They'll go, I went on to Hargreaves and used their advice tools online, end of.
Yes.
And as long as it doesn't leak out, and it won't, no one will market it, no right marketeer will take that to the end consumer.
Yeah.
So it's just a convenient label, and it's got a momentum with it. I don't think we're going to be able to stop it.
Do you think your sort of nonchalant attitude is because you grew up in the 70s? I reckon that might be the case. Maybe I need to go back to Star Wars just to get some better robot role models. Sorry, Jenna.
That's okay. So I don't know if we've got time for one more quick question from the audience. Inez Miller is asking, what can firms do to better communicate and sell the value of advice and financial planning? Quite a broad question, I suppose, but if you've got any thoughts.
It's a huge topic. I mean, I think going back to the very first question, RDR has started that journey by starting to get the professional qualifications up. So I think we need to start remembering that we're now a profession in its own right. I think probably the next thing is, as we start to use technology, don't use it in the bad way. Don't use it in the RoboCop way. Use it in the R2D2 way. So if we look at social media, how many people do you link in with or connect with, and then the next minute they send you an offer for a financial advice, do a free financial review? That's going back to old sales thing. Let's use the technology for what it's meant to be. So we're starting to use social media to try and get messages across. Use it as a conversation.
Yes.
Don't use it as a hard sales mechanism. Social media is about building relationships. So I guess my plea would be, use the technology for the purposes that you're used for. Start using technology to communicate, but use them in a soft relationship type way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was thinking of some of the research I saw some while ago of what is the value of advice, and one aspect, and I'm not saying it's the major aspect, but certainly one aspect was actually working with the customer and giving them reassurance throughout that relationship, and then perhaps at times when the market's diving down, just saying, hey, it's all right to stay invested. This was expected to buy the part. Markets do go up and down, stay where you are. And also, keep contributing. Again, that was part of what we discussed, etc. So it's almost that sort of lifestyle coach almost element of saying, actually, we've created a plan, it's still going okay, stay with it. And actually, that's something
We've
that
talked a lot about advice
value
here, haven't we, rather than service. So I think linked to the advice is the ongoing service, which has advice wrapped around it. But using technology to help with that ongoing service and building that trust is really key.
Yeah.
I think it's what's really interesting for me is technology empowers two things that are fundamental in terms of advice relationships for me. Number one is building relationships. As we've already alluded to, you can do that remotely, and most of my online relationships have turned into offline relationships. So it's interesting how that continues to develop. I am a married man, so
Yeah.
I wasn't talking about those sort of relationships. Yeah, I saw Chris's grin there and got a bit worried, Jenna, did you?
Where you're going?
But the second thing, and one we really underestimate in terms of educating consumers about the value of advice, is just tell some stories, yeah? So stories are how we've communicated since the dawn of time. We all tell stories, and what we do through the articles that we write, and I know we've done a couple for you guys, is just tell stories that make the value of advice clear. I wrote one the other day about one of our clients who had a guarantee on his pension. He didn't know about it, and he could have lost tens of thousands of pounds without accessing advice. And I think we are sometimes scared about telling those stories because of the regulatory threats. But if you do them generically, and we've checked with the regulator, you'll be fine. And I think, you know, build a relationship and tell stories is powerful.
You can move it from, well, I saw my advisor once a year and, you know, he came to my house and we had a cup of coffee, to actually, you know, he's sending me messages and stuff through social media all the time. And it's a very, very different relationship. And a profitable, much more profitable value one for both sides.
We know from the feedback we get that the majority of our not the majority, but a lot of our existing clients read all our article content. Now, what does that do? That builds our relationship with our existing clients, and then we're like to refer, which is
and they can
good for
pass it on
business.
to someone, can't they?
Absolutely, they can send them a link.
Yeah.
Okay, that's I think all the questions I have, so it just remains for me to thank the panel very much for taking part. Thank you, Mark, Chris and Chris. Okay.
Thanks, Jenna.
Yes, if you asked a question, someone from the team will get back to you, and thank you very much for watching. I hope you found it useful.